hello and a heartfelt welcome and thanks to those amazing, courageous humans making a change through their personal lived experience of suicide. My name is James Gallacher and I have the honourable task and balancing act today to balance the insight, the knowledge and the wisdom from these three men. So before we start the conversation, allow me just to acknowledge a couple of things. We acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We also acknowledge those with a lived experience of suicide. We acknowledge those who have considered ending their life and those who have attempted to do so. We acknowledge your courage and tenacity to carry and move on through that immense pain. We acknowledge those who care for loved ones through suicidal crisis. And we acknowledge the fear and helplessness you experience and your endless endeavours to empower them to live. We acknowledge those bereaved through suicide and may your immeasurable loss define a legacy and a mission to discover healing and a new purpose. We acknowledge those bereaved by suicide and we acknowledge all the magnificent lives we have lost to suicide and those who are struggling with life today. Everyone's lived experience is unique. Everyone's lived experience is valuable and everyone's lived experience can make a difference. Rose in the Ocean, Australian-based not-for-profit and for-purpose organisation was founded in order to change the way suicide is spoken about, understood and prevented. And we believe that most suicides are preventable. We're about improving suicide literacy across the country. Lived experience is having experienced suicidal thoughts, survived a suicide attempt, cared for someone who has been suicidal or being bereaved by suicide. We learn and we need to learn from each other to enable us to be more efficient and effective in personal advocacy and impact. Today in Australia, we're going to hear more about this. Today in Australia, 6 men will take their lives. 82 men will call an ambulance for mental health related deaths or issues. Deaths from suicide occur among males at a rate 3 times greater than that for females. In fact, the number of men who die by suicide in Australia every year is nearly double the national road toll. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Men talking about suicide, that takes courage and vulnerability. Well, vulnerability is a strength, and these guys have that in spades plus. Lane Stretton, a colleague, a mentor and a mate, says so beautifully, open your hearts and minds to the possibilities that a deeper understanding of suicide can bring to saving lives. Thank you, gentlemen. Our panellists today, Bruce McMillan, Glen Poole and Graeme Holdsworth. I hope you guys can draw on your extensive knowledge, insights and power to explore, among with other topics, the reasons why men don't talk about suicidal experiences. I might start and welcome you, Glen, in particular, the Chief Executive of Men's Health Forum and founder of Stop Male Suicide. You're a key stats man. I'd love to hear from you about what are some of the things that men don't talk about and what do they need to?
I'm going to be awkward and reframe the question straight away. Not as a way of avoiding talking about this very important topic, but just to try and expand our thinking a little bit. My experience is that the way we tend to think about male suicide doesn't help us in moving forward. The way we tend to think about male suicide is that it's a mental health issue, and that the reason that men are more likely to kill themselves than women is because women are better at talking about their mental health than men, and therefore the solution is that we need to get men to talk more about their mental health, and that will prevent suicide. Well, that's fundamentally flawed on a whole number of levels, right? Firstly, we know statistically that the vast majority of male suicides are not linked to a mental health diagnosis. They're linked to issues like relationship breakdown and financial distress and unemployment and trouble with the law and drink issues and all sorts of other problems in addition to mental health. In fact, something like 98% of suicides, according to coroner's reports, have at least one of these issues associated with them. So even if someone's got depression and suicides, they'll also have something else going on in their life, like a relationship issue or money issues or whatever. So that's the first thing to say, is that if we only think of male suicide as a mental health issue, and the solution being that men need to talk about their mental health, we're missing out on all those blokes. Because what we need men to be talking about isn't just their mental health. The second piece is that we need to understand that it's actually fundamentally more difficult for men to talk because of the way that they're heard. We listen to the problems that men and women have in very different ways. Now, if you want to get sort of like academic about it, there's research into what's called moral stereotypes. And when you look at moral stereotypes, basically it asks people how they would respond to different individuals with different issues. And what we find is that the research shows we experience more moral outrage, greater sympathy, and a greater sense of unfairness when a woman is experiencing problems than when a man is experiencing problems. So we actually need to recognize that fundamentally men live in a world that is less ready to hear about the problems that they have. So firstly, the problems that lead men to suicide aren't just mental health. They're much broader than that. Secondly, men are surrounded by friends, community, workplaces, services that are less ready to hear what they have to say. And then thirdly is the way that we process problems. All right. So, and again, there's lots of research on this, is that broadly speaking, don't want to get into really kind of like, simple stereotypes that men are like this and women are like that. Let me just say that right up top. Okay. All of these are generalizations. But men generally tend towards externalizing problems and women tend towards internalizing problems. And this shows up at really early age with boys and girls. And so when faced with the challenges that can lead to distress, that can lead to suicide, men will tend to talk about them from the outside in first rather than the inside out. So, and I give a really tangible example, a dad who's going through separation, dealing with lawyers, can't see his kids, so maybe got involved with the police, is having all these sort of like arguments with his wife or ex-wife or partner. He's not going to turn up at a service saying, I really need to process my feelings about what's going on. He's going to turn up and say, I need advice. What are my rights? What can I do about my housing? I'm going to go to court next Tuesday. What do I need to expect? Do I need to talk to a lawyer? All of this, all these external things. And if we don't meet men where they are, dealing with these distressing situations, processing from the outside in, we never get to have the more deep and meaningful conversations that are needed often in order to steer men off the path to suicide. So for me, it's about changing the way we listen and the way that we talk to men, and actually recognizing how fundamentally difficult it can be for suicidal men to have conversations because the people they're surrounded by haven't got the first clue about any of the stuff I've just been talking about.
Yeah, I love that, Glenn. It's in fact, it actually reminds me when I first met Bruce in Shell Harbour around this time last year. Bruce, you shared this amazing story, in fact, your gift, and the quote still sticks with me, that you said that you're in no man's land for decades, just surviving and not living. How were you able to find a voice, Bruce? You're on mute, ironically.
I'm on mute, yeah. I guess from unmuting is a good way to find a voice. For me, it's been a direct consequence of my involvement with the Illawarra Shoalhaven Suicide Prevention Collaborative, and that's probably an indirect consequence of my work as a mental health peer worker. I think I'm a person who tends to isolate, is probably a clinical way of describing it, but at least I keep to myself and keep my own company more often than not. Had it not been for there being an organisation that I was able to join and being in a relationship with a partner who encouraged me to join that organisation and facilitated me joining that organisation, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now. I would be alone and dealing with my own problems in my own ways, the way I always had. And I guess for me, ultimately, in the broad scheme of my life, finally overcoming substance use issues has probably, well, that's a double-edged sword that I have to be able to talk about later. But overcoming substance use issues is probably for me the foundational step in all of this. Had I not done that, then none of this would be possible.
Thanks, Bruce. And to you, Graeme, certainly when we hear from Glenn about being able to talk and the location to talk. You were in the working world of the fast masculine environment, as a retired architect now. How were you able to find your voice and talk about suicide?
Well, mine came after my attempt. Before that, I followed Glenn's line, is that I didn't talk about it. But the reason I didn't talk about it was I was project managing or project director of some of the larger construction projects in Australia, both Sydney, Melbourne, that sort of area. Once you put your hand up and said I wasn't dealing with my mental illness, I was out of a job. So the best way to get sacked was to say you weren't well. Unfortunately, I hung on for so long that my behavioural changed, my attitude, withdrawing, wanting to pick fights with people where before I hadn't to, anger, being unreliable in the end of the day, telling people I was on site. In reality, I was home struggling to get out of bed or open the front door and be able to get out of it. And I put myself into situations because of my mental health that I would normally have been in. They, rather than treat me for the illness or understand that there was an illness because I hadn't put my hand up, in the end, they just said, look, we've had enough of you, and I was removed from the job. That was it. Basically sacked. So it was from then on, trying to find a new job was almost impossible. People knew I'd been sacked. There's only a few that can operate in the sort of area that I used to in Melbourne. But the hardest part really was I didn't want to get back there. I had lost my vitality. I'd withdrawn so much that the idea of getting involved again was almost impossible. That caused a lot of family problems. More bizarre my behaviour got, and let me tell you it did, the tougher it was. In the end of the day, I had problems living with myself, so I don't know what it was like for people living with me. And my marriage broke down. So I had one of those triggers that Glenn talked about. There I was now about to be divorced. So, and prior to that, I had another trigger. I'd lost my job. So there I'm unemployed and about to be divorced. It was at that point that the feeling of uselessness, hopeless, no one wants me, I'm a burden to the world, everyone would be better off without me, they came through because of those two experiences. So it was a layer on top of the depression I'd already been suffering. I was being treated for the depression, but this was another layer. So another layer of shame and guilt and everything that goes with it. And I followed my internal thoughts and tried to take my own life. Now, since then, the road to recovery is never easy. Everyone has a different technique of doing it. Everyone has a different way of getting there. It's been a long road. I've learned about patience and I've learned about perseverance. But once I had hit the road to recovery, rather than try and get back into my old profession, I decided I had some unique lived experience, partly what I've told you today. So I've used my forced retirement into being involved in suicide prevention, first of all as a speaker for one of the large groups, and then getting involved in administration policy and other areas. If I could just fill in on the speaker one, this is one I like to tell. I think it picks up on what Glenn said. Our speeches are always structured. The first part of it was to tell them about the organisation you're talking about and fill them up with all the statistics about how many suicides there are and attempts and so forth. The middle bit was your struggle to find some sort of cure or a road to recovery, and then you finish it off with a call for action, recovery, hope, and all of those sorts of things. So there's the basic structure to the talk about suicide. When I spoke to vulnerable men of my age group, and I finished all of that, there'd be a line of people coming up to talk to me. And they didn't want to talk to me about any one of those three issues. What they wanted to come up and talk to me about was the fact that finally someone had said something that they felt. They had not only been sad and lonely, but they'd been totally alone. They believed that they were the only person in the world that felt like they felt. And all of a sudden they heard someone say, I feel the same. And I'd say to them, look behind you, there's another 5 guys that understand it too. And look into the room, start talking about it, and you'll find there's a lot of people here that are. And all of a sudden they found their tribe. They discovered they weren't alone. There were other people that felt like them, and they could talk about their problems, and that got them talking again. And that's the biggest input I found, apart from the technical bits of my talk, was to let people know you're not alone.
It's fantastic, Graeme. I love some of those words there you describe as finding your voice, but that sense of finding your tribe, that kindred spirit, that group of people that might also have a lived experience, and the concept of a problem shared is a problem halved. You're feverishly nodding there, Glenn. Is that your experience too about finding tribes and voice?
Yeah, there's two things really I wanted to just amplify from what I've just heard. The first is the really important point that it is risky. It can be risky for men to talk about this stuff. And Graeme's got a really tangible example of that. Not that they will lose face or they'll be embarrassed or people might feel a little less of them, but they could lose their job. Or one we come across is that, fathers going through the family courts, it could be used against them to keep their children away from them because they're not safe, because they're not mentally well. That there are risks to talking about, men in particular, talking about their mental health, which we need to acknowledge. We really need to acknowledge that rather than just sort of putting it all on men. But then what will enable those men to talk? Well, they need to find safe, this is the second piece I want to amplify, they need to find safe places where they can talk and safe people. And my experience going out in the world and speaking about suicide with men is exactly the same as Graeme's. And it doesn't matter whether it's on the social media or at a men's shed or at a work site, doesn't matter what the context. Whenever I do a talk about male suicide, similar to you, Graeme, there'll be a queue of blokes wanting to have a word with me to share their story because they know it's safe to share their story with me. And it's not because I'm special, it's because it's just because I've been there and created that environment where they understand that it's the norm and it's okay to talk about suicidality. And often, I don't know if you get this as well, Graeme, often they'll end it with saying, and I've never told anyone that. That's one of the phrases I hear very regularly. And so for me, back to the point I was trying to make at the very beginning, we need to create a world where we're surrounding men with people who it's safe for them to talk to. So I'm really into the whole thing about, building resilient communities amongst mates, amongst work colleagues, amongst families, sports clubs, wherever it is, where men are surrounded by other men who are really open to hearing, not just, and it can be women too, obviously, but there's something very special about that men talking to men, kind of normalizing that men talking to men. And for me, we should start with those of us who are doing okay, listening more, rather than expecting those who are most distressed and doing it tough to talk more.
Bruce, have you felt safe to tell your story in the workplace?
Muted again. Only where I work now. This has been the first time in my life because of the nature of the work I do. It's okay. It's also okay in the context of my work to be actively involved in the Suicide Prevention Collaborative, but I don't know there would be many other places where I could work or where I have worked where it would be okay to talk about suicidality at all. In fact, my earliest experiences of trying to talk about suicidality were in mid-adolescence, and the first time I very nearly got punched in the face. And the second time I was told that it's selfish and a coward's way out, and that I need to think about the people who are left behind, which was a very clumsy way to do it, but that was actually a useful piece of information. I need to think about the people that I will be leaving behind, and that sort of has stayed with me throughout my life. But in answer to your question, simply no. Until this job now, I would not have been comfortable at all talking about suicidality with any of my previous employers.
And it sounds like we're a long way from a culture whereby removing the stigma of mental health or suicide in the workplace conversations. We're a long way off that. Graeme, is that you're still feeling based on your experience?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the number of my old workmates that have come to me privately, and it's the same old stuff. You're really brave, Graeme, now to talk about it. We wouldn't do that because they're still in the business. And so you try and encourage them to do it. I've mentored a number because it is a stressful business, and they've eased their way out of it and gone off to somewhere else. But it's been private one-to-one that do it. If I could just pick up, you were talking about people nodding, and as I looked at the screen, I saw we all nod when we're in agreement with something. There's a fantastic program on SBS about male suicide. And at one point, the moderator asked one of the guys on the panel, "Why did you want to kill yourself?" And he stopped for a while, and then he looked up and he said, "I didn't want to kill myself. I just wanted to stop the pain." And all of a sudden, he started nodding, and they went around the audience, and they were all nodding. And it occurred to me then, there was a whole lot of people acknowledging one point of time, we understand we're not alone. And there I was nodding at home too while I was watching it on television. So there's those sort of one statements that bind people together, and you only discover that if you have lived experience. The other people in the audience didn't really get it.
Mm.
I noticed you were nodding too then, Glenn. So
Yeah, and I think that's a really powerful point. It's a point I've heard, and it's a point I often make when I'm talking about it, Graeme, because this is something that those men who've come back from the other side, so to speak, those who've attempted but didn't complete, will often tell that story, and then they may go on to live a life that's maybe challenging, but is often different or rich or whatever, because they get beyond the point where the pain is too much, right? And because that's a really important thing for people to understand, because one of the things that stops us getting involved and doing intervention is that we feel, well, if someone wants to kill themselves, that's their choice. There's nothing you can do to stop someone doing it. Well, actually, if you save someone at that point, they could have a whole nother life ahead of them, because it's not their life, to reinforce the point, it's not their life they wanted to end. It was the unbearable pain they were experiencing. They can get through that pain.
The work that I do with lived experience people is a great quote from a lady we met in Newcastle. She had a lived experience, of course, and she said, "My eyes see differently, my ears hear differently, and my heart processes differently." And that's all from her lived experience. And that connectivity that we get from, as you described, Graeme, that lived experience. I ask you, and in fact, all of you respond to this in some way, but what does it look like when men decide that life isn't worth living anymore? And in particular, what was it that kept you alive, Graeme?
With me, it kept me alive was a bit of serendipity. Someone came and saved me where it was least expected. So in reality, I had planned fairly well. So it was really that. So that was one thing that I thought, well, there was a recovery or someone who retrieved me, which was totally unexpected. And then it was a matter of getting good help. And I must admit, for a couple of years while I was getting the help, I was still feeling useless and hopeless, unwanted, unloved, a burden to society. So it hadn't gone away. It was reoccurring. I hadn't got to the point where I could overcome it. I got to the point where I could stand the pain. And it's taken a long time and a lot of different approaches and therapies to now be at the point where I can not only control the pain, but I can make it go away by having an attitude about my own life.
Wow.
And that came from a therapy that I currently use, which is called acceptance and commitment therapy. It's been around for a long time, and it's a simple one. Yeah, accept you're a little bit sadder and lonelier than other people. Don't try and avoid it. And don't go and hit the bottle like I used to try and get rid of it, because it doesn't. Live with it, feel it, understand it, and then follow your values. Go and do something that makes you feel good. And that's the antidote to feeling pain, is doing something that gives you pleasure.
Can you pigeonhole or box those emotions in some area which hopefully don't come back, or is it something that's always on your book?
No. It's trying to stop them coming back is the avoidance technique. Acceptance is letting them flow, dealing with them, sitting with them, being able to move thoughts on is an important part of it. Stopping rumination is an important part of it. But it's as basic as living a better lifestyle. Exercise, food, sleep, looking after your body, and that allows you to look after your brain.
Bruce or Glenn, what do you think? Can you comment on that?
Bruce, do you want to go?
Okay. When you asked the question initially, James, a very convoluted answer has occurred to me, and I'm aware of the time, so I'll try to A, not get it too out of control, and B, keep it as brief as possible. But what I can only speak for myself, and what it looks like when my life isn't worth living anymore is exactly that. It's an existential crisis. It's not necessarily a mental health issue. I mean, at the base for me, there is what a clinician would call a mental health issue, which is a depressive condition. But in the context of my life from early childhood onward, that's not surprising. So I get to the point from time to time, and this is often as a direct consequence of something that sort of Glenn sort of alluded to rather than sort of made specific earlier. For me, it's when my sense of identity is threatened significantly, that can lead to a suicidal crisis. When my sense of who I am gets on really, really shaky ground, that's when I become sort of more prone to think the best solution for me is to end my life, which is sort of the pain that Graeme is talking about. It's the pain of existence. And what has kept me from sort of acting on those feelings in the past is what you alluded to earlier, being trapped in no man's land. Like, I had the experiences in adolescence of, as I said, almost being physically assaulted when I tried to talk to someone about suicidality. So, okay, that's something you'd keep to yourself. And then a friend at school said, that's a selfish thing to do, and what about the people that are left behind? So I don't want to be alive and I can't kill myself. And then later on, I got into a relationship and had a child. So then there's a child in the mix, and I don't want to leave that child with the legacy of a father who killed himself. So for me, something that I'd done from early adolescence onward just completely broke off the chain. That was substance use. Now, I said it was a double-edged sword earlier, and I meant that, because one of the things I've experienced in my life is dysphoria, which is, as the name suggests, the exact opposite of euphoria. I feel awful a lot of the time, or I have felt awful a lot of the time. And drug and alcohol use didn't make me feel good. It stopped me feeling bad. It stopped me feeling terrible. And drugs and alcohol, in that sense, have kept me alive. But when I got to the stage where, as you mentioned before, I was in no man's land, and I was in there for a long time, and there's a child in the mix, unconsciously, but quite deliberately at the same time, I tried to use substance use as what was described to me in a 12-step program a long time ago as suicide by installments. I wanted to die accidentally of a drug overdose or excessive alcohol consumption, so I'm dying deliberately, but it looks like an accident. So yeah, that's the long and convoluted answer to the question, what it looks like and what's kept me alive. So it's sort of, yeah, a combination of guilt and shame about what's left behind and the pressure being taken off from time to time with substance use. Yeah, so I don't know how helpful that is.
Well, it's helpful to know that, you know, your coping mechanisms might be someone else's too. Thanks for sharing, Bruce. Glenn, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, to make it personal for a moment, I was at my most suicidal when going through separation with my daughter involved, when my daughter was about 20 years ago. So mine was very much linked to relational crisis, but then these are the things mounted on top, Bruce has talked about, turning to alcohol, which is very common, certainly something that was a real slow motion suicide, they sometimes call it, drinking and smoking yourself to death, So I was certainly, drinking and smoking and doing all these adapting all these unhealthy coping behaviors. And I think one way of looking at suicide is something that men do when they feel they can't cope. And, in a very kind of, again, sort of stereotypical way, but it's, or I prefer to view it as an archetype. Men tend to be more fixing, solution orientated. And so when you start to get some issues, you try and fix them. Again, classic man going through separation. What do I need to do? What do we need to get a lawyer? What's the best lawyer I can buy? What are the steps I need to take in order to fix this problem? But relationship strain is not an easy fix, right? It's an ongoing thing. And what people don't realize with separation is that, your relationship, as it has been, ends, but a whole new relationship starts with your ex and your children and all the rest of it. It's an ongoing thing that you need to negotiate, and there is no quick fix, right? So for those things that we can't fix, we tend to look at how can we cope with them. And we may cope with them in healthy ways. We may go meditate and do yoga and, drink lots of water, or we may, and process our emotions with our counsellor, or whatever a healthy coping mechanism is. Or we may cope in unhealthy ways, like drinking and smoking and avoiding and all the rest of it, but it's still coping, right? And actually, unhealthy coping is better than not coping. Which is kind of something that Graeme alluded to with what the drink is covering up, but it's at least he's coping, right? And so for me, something to look for is not just what problems is a bloke facing in his life, which you can get by observing, but you can also get by really talking and finding out what's going on at that material level. What's going on with your partner? What's going on with work? What's going on with your financial situation? It's important to know those things, but then you need to also understand. For one person, a breakup, a bit of debt, a driving fine, or a spell in prison, drinking a crate of beer every night, that might not be a problem. Very, very easy to cope with for one person. For another person, that might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So we don't just need to know what problems a bloke's dealing with, but how well are they coping? How well are they personally coping? That's the thing that I'm always listening out for in terms of, how do you tell if a bloke's not, at risk? It's not just what issues is he dealing with, but how is he personally coping with them? What coping mechanisms has he got, and are they working? And what was the second part of the question about?
I guess it's, what was it that kept you alive?
Yeah. Oh, look, for me, very much that, that sense of identity that Bruce talked about. Being a father was key to my identity. My experience of being a father was shattered by separation. And so that's what really challenged me. But then I had the opportunity to build a whole new relationship as a father. And there was no, at the end of the day, for me personally, that bond of fatherhood was stronger than anything, and strong enough to keep me going. And I say that in no way to belittle those fathers who do find it's too much and can't cope. But for me, that's the thing that actually managed to hold on to and keep my head above water. So yeah.
It's interesting that both Glen and Graeme, you mentioned that thing about coping mechanisms. I heard a great quote recently, that idea of unhelpful help as opposed to helpful help. And sometimes it can be unhelpful, that help. And I guess that's the question I want to pose to you, is this concept of what are some of the best ways people have managed to reach out to you when you've needed support, Graeme? What are some of the best ways people have reached out to you?
I'll answer that in just a minute. I just wanted to go back a step, if I could. When we're talking about the problems of talking, one was the stigma of talking of jobs, and Glen just reminded me of the other one, which is a big one, and that's people that don't believe there's a problem. Pull your socks up, get on with it, toughen up. And people believe that that's men. Men be tough, they don't cry and so forth. My example is it's not, it's a lot of people. And when Glen was talking about separation, one of the big problems in my separation was there was no understanding. There was no belief that I was really ill. I was desperately ill, and they just couldn't believe that it was true. What's wrong with you? You've always been strong. You've always been successful. Pull your socks up. I had a friend got over it in a month. You've been miserable for a year. What is wrong? And that's one of the big messages is that we have to get out there, I think, is get rid of this idea that you can toughen up, that pull your socks up and get on with life, that you are capable of being able to talk about it. And that's when we get back to really helps, was an ability to be able to talk about it. And talk about it openly with friends, openly with people I don't even know. At the start of my speech, I always start with the vulnerability line. And it's true. Before everyone, I got nervous. There I was, and the root to the nervousness was vulnerability. I was about to tell a whole room full of people a whole lot of stuff about myself that only 3 years earlier I wasn't going to tell my best friend, my workmates, my wife, anyone else about. And that's the change. And you've got to accept that vulnerability is not a bad thing. It's a strength, not a weakness.
Absolutely. Yeah, I grew up with a saying that used to go around saying, real men don't eat quiche. And I just, for some reason, that always stuck with me. And that idea of, certainly, Graeme, in the industry that you're in is, have a glass or a cup of concrete and harden up, that sort of approach, as opposed to be vulnerable, open up, talk, have empathy, show compassion, listen, all those things that we actually should be doing. And yet we grew up in a society that said, don't blow your own trumpet, quit while you're ahead, keep quiet, all those sorts of things. But ultimately we can't do that because it bottles up. And that bottling up approach can get worse and worse, as we know. How about you, Bruce? What do you think are some of the things that might have helped you in terms when people reached out, when you needed support?
Well, yeah, that's probably a little difficult for me to answer, actually, because I've had one situation in my life where the person I lived with realised, hang on, there's something quite profoundly wrong here. This person needs help. And they persuaded me to seek help via the public health system. And that resulted in my one hospitalisation for mental health issues. And I was quite profoundly suicidal at the time. So for me, it was having someone around who recognised that there were issues and that there was something that could be done about the issues. But I was quite angry about that for years afterwards because I'd been that depressed dozens of times before. That was all news to me, that this was enough to warrant a hospitalisation, and that's what you did in those circumstances. So I think more broadly, what will be helpful for people like me is having more conversations like this, where it's okay to talk about these things, where it's okay specifically for men to talk about feeling suicidal, for men to talk about feeling emotionally vulnerable, for men to talk about how, and this could be a little bit controversial, but how difficult it can be to be particularly an Anglo-Celtic man at this time in history, because it's easy for people in that category to feel like they're guilty until proven innocent on a number of sort of social issues at the moment. So it's a difficult time for middle-aged white men to be alive, I think, and I don't mean to sort of make too big an issue of that, but the idea that people in the category that I fit into can have problems can be quite readily dismissed. I think, as Glenn alluded to earlier, that it can be quite easy to dismiss that people in my category and our category, in fact, can have issues that are worth talking about at all.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Glenn, I'll ask you a question and the others can respond as well, but how can we generally amplify voices of men who experience suicidal thoughts, who are suicide attempt survivors? What do you think some of the barriers that need to be removed?
I think there's a broader version of the point that Graeme just made, that this willingness to actually hear. There's this double narrative that is going on at the moment, which is, one, men need to talk more, And then the other one is two men need to shut up because, you know, because we take up too much space, we dominate public life, we mansplain, you know. So there's these two very contradictory narratives. One is that we want men to talk, and the other is we want men to shut up. I absolutely adore and acknowledge the lived experience space, and I really acknowledge all of the men in the lived experience space. However, what one of my criticisms would be, or let's say points for improvement, right, would be that there's a kind of box around what story, and this is no criticism of the men in the lived experience space. This is more actually what the world is ready for, right? The world is not yet ready for. The world's ready for men to come and tell a story which said, you know, I had mental health issues. I was a typical bloke. I didn't talk about my mental health issues, and I nearly died as a result. And men really need to be vulnerable and open up more. People are ready to hear that story, and it confirms the existing stereotype. And there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of power in that alone, because it's shifting the conversation. However, the moment that men start to tell stories about, well, actually the issues that I went through were, I don't know, I was sexually abused by my teacher, or my mother beat me as a child, or my ex-wife treated me appallingly, or the health system or the legal system or the government treated me badly. That's when you get boohoo, don't be a victim. And it's not just the masculine sort of cup of concrete kind of conversation. It's the, you know, men have actually got all this privilege and power. Why are you complaining? So we need to be prepared to hear whatever stories men want to bring to the table. And the big key here, both culturally and on a personal level, is not just the willingness, but the ability to listen. I think collectively, men and women of all backgrounds, we have to get better at listening.
Yeah, totally agree.
We can hear that, but we're really not great at listening, right? And so the only way you get more stories told is when people are prepared to listen with greater depth to people's stories. And that's both in terms of what we culturally will listen to, and the stories we'll be prepared to hear, the uncomfortable, difficult stories we'll be prepared to hear. You know, who would be prepared to hear? It's difficult to say here, you know, a man tell a story about being sexually abused by a priest or something like that. But who's prepared to hear a story of a man who says he was sexually abused by his mother? And they exist, and they're at higher risk of suicide. There are certain stories we're really not ready to hear, but they are linked to greater risk of suicide. But on that individual level, in terms of what works, to go back to the last question, in terms of people reaching out, is people who are really prepared to listen.
And it's listening with compassion. It's listening with compassion. It's listening with empathy. It's listening without judgment. It's recognising that everybody's lived experience is unique and valuable, and everyone can make a difference. Thank you.
Can I butt in here? I'd like to follow up on what Glen just said. People with lived experience are used in one way, and that's to tell their story as a talking head, so generally their story, and that's the one that's the acceptable one. The one that Glen just said was when you add the problems to it or the reasons for it, it becomes not. There is a forum for people to tell those stories about what went wrong, and that's in the public policy area. That's in the organisations that look after suicide prevention. That's the missing space for lived experience, where they set policy, where they talk about what are the real triggers, where the effort should be. It shouldn't be dominated by the clinicians and the academics, but it should be able to people with lived experience to say, no, you should be at the door of the family law court. You should be down at settling for the time the guy first walks in, having to do a public appeal for money. That you've got to understand where the spaces are. And those stories come from people that are able to tell it. They can do it in certain areas where they get involved in charities that do work in the space where they suffered. And you'll find that that's where a lot of men can do some real good because they have lived experience in it. So we've got to be able to absorb lived experience people in the broader world. 65,000 of us a year supposedly attempt. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't cover one socio-economic group. So there's a whole range of experience that people that are capable from, from labourers to lawyers, that all have the lived experience, and we don't tap into it and we don't use it. We only use them to fill out forms, take surveys, and be talking heads at one where, are you okay day at some office gathering and so forth, which is the gentle one. That's the gentle talk. That's not the serious talk.
Yeah, it's a combination of those tools we need to bring into our kit bag, isn't it, Graeme? I might just open up to the audience because there's a lot of questions coming up, and if I can pose these and either of you gentlemen can respond to them. First one from Anonymous, but in an ideal world, we would have 50 to 50 male to female ratio in clinical service provision. In the absence of male clinicians, what can female professionals do to enhance engagement to create safety with men in our community seeking help? Any suggestions there, gentlemen?
Yeah, I'll happily take that one. As it's an issue we've raised at the Australian Men's Health Forum, the lack of gender diversity in the mental health space, right across a range of professions. About 70% to 80% of professionals, like psychologists, like mental health peer workers, social workers, are women, and that creates naturally creates a very female-friendly space. So, firstly, I think what needs to be done collectively is we just need to acknowledge that it's not a criticism of the great women working in that space. It's just a fact that needs to be acknowledged, and the potential knock-on effect is that those services are going to be more welcoming to women than they are to men. And so to be able to hear that first and not hear it as a criticism is really important. And it's not the same as saying that that only men can help men and only women can help women. Right? Because who do you want to be helped by? You want to be helped by someone who really gets you and listens to you. You don't care whether that's a man or a woman. Now, at some levels of peer work, for example, being a separated dad who's gone through the experience of being a separated dad, it might just be other men you need to be with. A veteran who fought on the front line might just be other vets who fought on the front line that you need to be with for part of your healing process. But some of the best people that I've come across over 20 years of being in the sort of the broader men's health sector, some of the best people working with men have been women. So we need to get those two things right first. One, acknowledge that it is an issue, but two, be clear that that women can be very good at helping men. You don't have to be a man to help. And then there's a whole world from the men's health sector of what we call male-friendly approaches. That this is on a sort of a general level. How do you make the whole service more male friendly? Loads of evidence and examples of the things that you can do to make services more accessible to men, but also then on a one-to-one level. There's a growing, I think the work that Zach Seidler for the Man Island project and now at Movember is doing in terms of looking at how do you make one-to-one interventions, what's the evidence of what works at a one-to-one level at men. Actually recognizing that training practitioners to work with men is a distinct skill set. And so, yeah, you need individual change at a practitioner level, but you need collective service-wide change. But in a way that isn't blaming, it's not blaming of people. It's actually just dealing with where we are and asking, how can we do the great work that you do even better so that we can access and reach more men?
I can add one more to that. There's an ability to really jump the gender divide, and that is the lived experience. There are women in the tribe too. So what you've got to be able to do is have lived experience in the clinical space, and to be people treated with, I understand, I've been down your road, I've followed your trip. And there are a lot who have it, who don't admit to it because of the stigma problem. So you get a cold and professional and clinical approach where really you could get an empathetic and compassionate approach if they opened up and said, I understand where you're coming from. Now, the lived experience will help the gender divide. You can get that same nod of the head, absolute contact, understanding that you're part of the group from a woman as well as a man.
Well said. It's about that connectivity, isn't it, Graeme?
It's about lived experience being open in both directions. At the moment, it's open in the direction of people with lived experience trying to convince the public you can talk about suicide. Let's get rid of the stigma. Let's get rid of the shame. We don't look back on ourselves. And the real stigma's on the other side. The people that run and look after suicide prevention, they're the worst. The amount of lived experience that are involved in their organisations, the way that they talk about lived experience within their organisations, the way they recognise it, it's totally at odds to what they're trying to do publicly.
Mm. Thanks, Graeme. There's another question here. I'll try and read this. This is a fairly lengthy one from Christopher. Thank you for sharing so honestly and generously. I've just completed a piece of research for Beyond Blue, looking at suicide risk factors in people who visit the Beyond Blue website and take anxiety and depression checklist screener. One of the findings was that higher levels of psychological distress were related to a stronger sense of feeling like a burden on others. This relationship was found to be stronger in men than in women. We know the sense of burden is a risk for suicide. Does the panel have any thoughts as to why this might come through more strongly in men? What do you think, Bruce or Glenn?
I'm happy to, if unless anyone else wants to jump in first.
I'll just jump in very quickly and say burden is antithetical to the socially accepted concept of what a man is. It's probably very old school and probably not very politically correct, but a man is meant to be a provider, not a burden on other people. So that, in terms of what I said before about negative impacts on identity, has got to be catastrophic. The idea that you're no longer able to look after not only yourself but other people, that you are in fact a burden on other people, is it's completely understandable to me that it has catastrophic consequences for individuals.
Glenn, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just to amplify what Bruce has said, and it's got nothing to do with political correctness, Bruce. It's just absolute fact that the world we live in, men on average expect and are expected to be more independent than women are. And if you doubt that, then look at what happens when men and women have a child in 2020. You know, for all our incredible evolution, culturally and socially, the differences between men and women show no more starkly than when men and women have children, and women become physically much more dependent on others for support and safety. And, you know, a couple that's shared providing, earning equally, or often the woman earning more, will suddenly have that tipped on its head, where the woman is full-time at home, certainly for a period, and the men start working more. And all of the social, and it's not just biological, it's psychological, and it's social, because all the social supports around that, all the benefits and help go to enforcing this notion that the man's role there is to be independent and provide, and a woman can be dependent and make choices about whether she stays at home full-time, works part-time, or goes back to work, and there'll be various maternity benefits and all the rest of it to support it. So yeah, men expect and are expected to be independent, and you can argue the toss about whether that's evolution or social construction. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what causes it. The fact is that is the lived reality of being a man still today in 2020.
Yeah, and a large part of it also comes back to identity. Everyone is known, and men more so, for what they do. So you're John Smith, the plumber, and a lot of your mates are plumbers, and a lot of your social contacts are people you work with or are within the trade. You lose your job or you hit retirement, you are you're now John Smith, and there's nothing. There's no identity. And where in families, it is Mrs. Smith, the family person, because all of those images, identity revolves around that sort of stuff. So men have to get more involved with the things that allow them to have identities out of their work. And that's being father, being part of the family, being a provider in other sense, apart from money, but with other efforts. So if we can broaden our identities, we don't fall over the cliff when one of them is removed.
Agree, Graeme. Final question from the audience, and I love this one because it's some real practical stuff we're seeking, but what practical tips for support can you offer for the partners and family of men who are struggling with opening up about their feelings? Bruce, can you maybe give us some insight into that one?
So it's practical tips for what to do to support a man to open up about his feelings. Okay. Don't laugh. That would be the first one. I guess just do whatever you need to do in your particular context to make the person or the man know, the male person know, that it's okay to talk about anything, that nothing is off limits, that nothing is out of bounds. But I mean, that's easy for me to say. Like I have a lot of occasions where I talk to people that have particular types of issues. I talk a lot about suicide prevention, etc., etc. It's probably not going to be terribly easy for the average person to do that, but there are resources available. I can't think offhand exactly what it's called, but there are good resources available for answering exactly that question, like what can a family or particularly a spouse do to help a man to open up about feelings of suicidality and just emotional vulnerability in general. But I like to think that it's probably going to be less and less of an issue in time, because I think generations younger than me are probably more metrosexual, is that the word, more inclined to talk about how they feel than my generation and older are.
Or there's probably more empathy in, as Graeme said before, that listening, that ability to listen as a society. It reminds me of the great comedian Carl Barron. He does a great skit that the way we speak as Australian, we don't tell you how we're feeling, we'll tell you how we're not. And in fact, when we're asked the question, how are you going? Oh, not bad. How far is it now? Oh, it's not far now. You know, that sort of thing. And then you've got to kind of guess the rest. And as men or as individuals, we've got to start thinking about responding to real feelings rather than short, closed-up responses. What do you think, Graeme?
The answer to that is patience, I think, if to get through to them. Open questions asked in different ways, because you never get the answer first up. Allow it to come. Giving advice is sometimes very messy. I know how you feel is one that's given on a regular basis. You don't know how they feel because you're not in their shoes. So continually, rather than saying, I know how you feel, how do you feel? You're looking a bit like this, are you feeling any better? Why did you do that? So open questions allow them to slowly bring it out, but the real skill is listening. And sitting in silence is the best form of listening sometimes. So you don't have to force a conversation. Just sit in their pain, and finally they'll share it.
Yeah, great. And I also love that concept of, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you going? You know, 10 being great, 1 being not so good, and kind of putting a number to it, which opens up a bit more of that dialogue. I've got 2 minutes left, and what I like to do at the end of these sessions is ask you guys one final question. And first, thank you so much for your time, all three of you. Thank you so much for sharing your lived experience and being vulnerable and sharing that courage. But also, the question I have for you is, I'll ask you first, Glenn. If you had a superpower, what would it be?
If I could choose one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. One? Yeah.
Yeah. Look, firstly, I just want to acknowledge the fact that Bruce twice mentioned getting punched when he spoke. So one of the things we should know about how do you help someone open up, it's not, don't punch them. And Bruce, if you're ready at some point, I actually really would love to hear that story. And this is purely to do with my curiosity and love of a story, that other than anything else. And it's entirely your choice whether to tell that story or not at any point. Look, my superpower would be to the thing I've spoken about quite a lot, and others have too, is actually to overnight deepen the world's ability to listen, plus embrace difference. I think we're in this really interesting time where the world in many ways is becoming more divided, and people are shouting past each other and incapable of actually, seem to be incapable of acknowledging that there's lots of different ways of seeing the world, right? And that manifests at a political level, but it also manifests at an individual level. There are many different ways of experiencing things, you know, many different ways of dealing with things. And there's actually real richness and genuine human connection to be had when we can actually genuinely learn to listen and connect with other human beings and actually begin to see the world through their eyes and their heart, because we're actually open to whatever they have to share with us and whatever they have to tell us. And so one of the little catchphrases I often use in terms of, like, you know, how do you do suicide prevention? I say ultimately what you need to do is you need to open your ears, open your heart, open your mind, and listen. And I would love to be able to give that superpower to every human being.
Thanks, Glenn. Graeme, what was your superpower be?
Superpower. If I had a superpower, I would get rid of judgment and replace it with empathy and compassion.
Nice.
So remove judgment from the world and make people much more empathetic and compassionate, also to themselves as well as other people. Less judgment of yourself and much more self-compassion.
Thank you. And Bruce?
Well, first of all, Glenn, I've been punched more often than I care to remember, but I mentioned the same incident twice, and I was almost punched in the face when revealing to someone that I felt suicidal. They didn't actually punch me in the face, but but in response to the question, I'll probably say what Graeme and Glenn have said using different words. I'd probably want, and this isn't going to get me a job at Marvel Comics either, I wouldn't think. I want enough empathy and insight to be able to experience another person's worldview, to see the way they see the world, and I think that is just going to be very helpful. It would be a superpower in the context of what I do for a living and what I do in terms of suicide prevention. To be able to see the world through another person's eyes is very, very helpful in all of this type of work.
Absolutely, Bruce. And I've seen you walk the shoes of other people when you've shared your story and listened to others. So I believe you're more than halfway there. Thank you all again. I do believe you are supermen, superhumans, being able to show courage, vulnerability, and share your lived experience. So thank you again. Look after yourselves, and thank you, audience, for joining in.